Hey, in this video, I'm going to cover the basics of auto layout. So first, to introduce the problem a bit, I have this demo project here, and I have just opened it to a single view template, and I see this funny square view. I don't quite know why Apple thought it was a good idea to make this view gigantic and square, but you can always change it by coming up here to properties, and there's nothing wrong with designing it in this kind of ridiculous view, but you can also change the font size to something that makes more sense to you if you like. So I can change it to like an iPhone 5 dimension, for example. And the thing that I really like about views in iOS is they're pretty simple, especially when compared to HTML and CSS. You just have, so this view is equivalent to a div. And here, if you unpack what I call the layers view by clicking on this lower right-hand panel right here, you expose this set of layers. So if I drag this in, and let me change the color so we can see it, I could start to do my view layout. And the beauty and simplicity of it is unlike HTML, it's not a flow-based layout. It's a just absolute position with the view hierarchy. So for example, if let's say that this was a Facebook or a Tumblr post, and this was like an individual story or post, and so here's maybe the frame of it, and I can drag maybe my profile picture. And so maybe I have a few other elements in here, like say like a title or something. I'll just draw this. I'll just block it out, and then maybe like say the body of the post here. So this is great, except for if I now run this. So first, I'm going to disable auto layout. So I'm going to click on this document tab here. I'm going to disable auto layout. Allow it to disable size classes as well, just to kind of revert it to, the past. And then I'm going to run this on an iPhone 6 and demonstrate what the issue is. So with an iPhone 6 Plus especially, this is going to get wider and it's going to get taller. And so I'm going to see that my design here is kind of this goofy looking thing where it's kind of tucked into the upper left-hand corner. So that isn't quite what I like. And so in the olden days, you had this system called springs and struts, which is represented by these red arrows right here. And so if I wanted the kind of this thing to expand with the size of the phone, then I would configure this. And so generally speaking, both auto layout and springs and struts fundamentally exist for one reason, which is when my parent resizes, how should I behave? And like, for example, how do we want these items to behave? And the answer is kind of, it depends. It's kind of a design question. So for example, in this situation, I could have this center vertically, or center horizontally, or I could have it grow in width. I could have it pinned to the right, or I could have it pinned to the left. So both systems, both the old one, like for example, if I were to click on this and to click on these internal arrows. So these internal arrows indicate how this child should behave when the parent grows. And so this funny zooming view here, which just took me a long time to understand what this meant, how to interpret this, says, as my parent grows in width, my own width should grow, and the same with my height. So this is something called adjusting the auto resizing masks. So for example, if I were to run this again, I would notice that just by tweaking the auto resizing mask, it already made this a little bit more intuitive, although maybe the way the height grew wasn't intuitive. And so the explanation for the height growth is, well, this delta between this frame and this frame is the same difference between the height of an iPhone 5 and the height of an iPhone 6 Plus. So believe it or not, for the most part, in the olden days, auto resizing mask and springs and struts, this system was pretty good for the basic use cases. Where it really broke down was when it was working with labels. And that's where, if you look into a code base and you search for this function called layout subviews, there's a lot of manual layout code there that had to do with label recalculation usually. and it was very meticulous. You had to go and manually measure each label and say, well, how, what's the wrap width, and how much should you resize. And God forbid I got a mock that had like 4 or 5 labels related to each other, because it'd be like all this silly math just trying to figure this out. It really felt like you were back in the dark ages of layout. So I'm going to re-enable. So let me reset this back to what it was before. And I'm going to re-enable auto layout. So I'm not going to dwell too much on how this works or what this means, because this is kind of the past. So instead, for the most part, we're going to use auto layout. So if I run this again, I can see that my original problem is back. So let's just solve that first initial problem. So in this case, I have not yet added any auto layout rules or constraints. So I'm going to use the words constraints or rules interchangeably. And so it puts a default set of rules in place based on the auto resizing mask. So the rule is, once auto layout is enabled, it kind of ignores auto resizing mask, except if I haven't put any rules in place, it will derive some default rules based on the auto resizing mask property. However, once I start adding constraints or rules, it throws that out the window. So there's 3 tiers to auto layout. Auto layout is this incredibly powerful system. It's a set of like linear equations that are run that describes the position. And so the first tier of usage is these 3 controls right here. So interface builder or storyboard based definitions are what are the easiest ways to add your auto layout constraints. If you want to do that in code, then the second tier is using something called the visual formatting language, which is this like shortcut ASCII syntax for describing what the rules are. And if you're not happy with that, then there's a third and most powerful tier where you can define the linear equations yourself. Y is equal to ax plus b, and so you can choose what a is, and you choose what b is, and you choose what x and y is. So first, let me show you how to define it using the highest level tier here. So once I start adding rules, the rule is you have to keep on adding rules until the system can derive the x, y, width, and height. It has to have all 4 numbers. So for example, this control right here, which I call the TIE Fighter control. This is the most commonly used one. This is where I define my sizes, if I'm defining sizes, and this is where I'm defining my margins. So I'm going to uncheck constraint to margins. Constraint to margins is an iOS 8 and above concept. So let me kind of uncheck this real quick. I'll explain that more in detail. And I noticed that I can choose this drop-down thing to choose what the rule is with respect to. And so it kind of chooses this nearest neighbor rule. And right now, all I can choose is with respect to my parent. So I'm going to say, okay, well, I want to be pinned with respect to the top here. And so I'm going to click this Add One Constraint button. And so it's a little bit hard to see, but you see this like little bar right here, which indicates this rule. So this is unhappy. It's when it's unhappy, it's this orange color. And the reason it's unhappy is that based on this one rule, all it can derive from x, y, width, and height is the y value of what this frame should be. So if I click on this arrow right here, this is where it shows me my auto layout warnings, and it shows me that like it needs additional constraints or rules to understand what the x should be and what the width and the height should be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, I want to again uncheck this constraint of margins, and then create these left and right rules, which says, you know what, always keep, no matter what, keep within 8 pixels of the left and the right. I'm not going to set a bottom margin because I want it to have a fixed height. So if I add these constraints, I see that my bars turn this blue color. Blue means you're good to go. And if I run this again, let's see what this behavior is. So the internals of my story, of my post, aren't right yet, but I can see that the frame itself at least is expanding to fill the iPhone 6 Plus, which is what the behavior that I want in this case. And so like if I even rotate the phone by using my command left and right arrow keys, then I can see that even if I don't know if this is the behavior that my designer might want, but naively what I want to do is I'll expand the post so it just fills the width. So it's pretty basic at this point to kind of add this. Now, where this gets a little bit unintuitive is, let's say that maybe you want to change what this margin should be. And so maybe you would think, oh gosh, well, let me add, let me kind of set this to another value, like say, I want to drop it down a little bit, make it 20. And I add this. I can see that unlike, say, HTML or CSS, this is not just like a top margin setting that you tweak. This is an additional rule that you've created. And so now I have two conflicting rules. One rule saying that I want it to be 8 away, one rule saying that I need to be 20 away. And so I want to delete one of them. So the constraints are shown here in this view, although I don't tend to like using this view because you can see that even with this small number of rules, it's already getting a little bit hard to identify, and this gets infinitely worse once things start to pile in. So you can try to click in your view controller here, but what will happen is that it's also pretty hard to manipulate. So my favorite way is I like to click on this ruler, and then once you highlight the view of interest, it will show you, it'll list out the view, so I can see the trailing, which means the right-hand side, leading, which means left. They use trailing and leading because it's left and right agnostic. In some countries, trailing is actually the left, whereas for trailing, it's the right for us. So top space is the one that I want to modify. And I can see that there's two top space constraints. So I'm going to take the 21 and I'm going to delete it. So in this system, you want to modify your existing constraint, not add additional constraints. So the first thing that I might want, the first gotcha that I might want is, let's say that I'm happy with this. The blue is here. I can see my auto layout warning went away, but I'm like, oh gosh, I want to nudge the top. And so I'm going to take this and I'm going to say drag this. And I can see that, let me exaggerate this a little bit. I'm going to pull this way down. I can see that it's no longer blue. Now, in the world of auto layout, you should never ever have these yellow warning auto layout warnings, because that means that something is not quite right. And so if you're ever trying to debug some behavior and if you have some warnings, you need to resolve all the warnings before you try to explain what a behavior is. So if I run this again, let's see, I just cross my fingers and just hope it's okay. I can see that maybe it's not quite what I expected, because what it did is it returned me back to my initial position. So the rule with auto layout is that it's gonna, once you start adding the rules are gonna override the position that you specified in this in the layout. And so what you want to do here is you want to use this rightmost control. So if I click on this rightmost control, I can see a lot of options here. So let me make sure my view is selected. Never at any point should you click on any of these add, reset, or clear. It's going to, Xcode is really aggressive about adding constraints. It adds like 1 million constraints, and that often causes like way more problems than it solves. It never guesses correctly. And so you'll always want to add your constraints yourself. But you do want to use these two helpful fixes, update frames or update constraints. If you click on update frames, then it's going to say, well, respect the rules, right? And so the rules told me like I want to be 8 pixels from the top of here. And so reset the frame so that it respects these rules. Or alternatively, you can say, no, this is the new position. So can you update the rules or constraints so that this new position is satisfied? So I can update the constraints right here. And so now if I run it, this will be in the proper position below. And so at this point, it's pretty straightforward. Let me kind of I'll move back here, update the constraints again. It's pretty straightforward to mimic or achieve parity with the behaviors that we saw in springs and struts. So for example, another use case is, let's say that we were in Foursquare now, and this is a Foursquare post, and there was that kind of Foursquare check-in button. I don't know if they still put it there, but like in the olden days at least, there used to be a button on the bottom here that allowed me to check in Foursquare. And so this button would be pinned to the bottom of the screen. And so let's say I were to add my margins here. So I no longer want that top margin. I'm going to unclick constraint and margins. And by the way, so what this margins is it's a new iOS 8 concept. So up until iOS 8, views did not have the concept of like padding and margin like there is in CSS. So if you ever wanted to have that, you would have to create a container to create that arbitrary margin or padding. So they added the concept of margins, like these internal margins of views. So that's why, for example, things will even appear negative because there's a default margin value that sets you inside the container. Because this is iOS 8 and above, if you try to add this, nothing bad will happen if you click constrained margins. Here, if you forget, the only thing that will be bad is if you run this on iOS 7, it's going to be a little bit offset from where you think it should what you thought you specified. So nothing fatal if you check it, except it's going to break iOS 7 compatibility a little bit. So as a general rule, I uncheck this for now. So I'm going to say, well, don't pin it to the top, but create a rule so it's at the bottom. And instead of pinning it to the left and the right here at 131, because that's going to stretch the button, I'm going to say, well, I should be a fixed width and a fixed height. So I'm going to add these three constraints. So you can see that it's not completely blue because the Y is known and the width and the height is known, but the X value is unspecified. So I'm going to use this final left-hand control. And so this left-hand control has a lot of cool alignments. When I specify like several of these, I can line up their leading edges or their trailing edges. I don't really recommend using those too aggressively, and I'll explain why in a second. But here, this also has my alignment within the context of my container. So for example, I can click on this horizontally center in container. To create this rule. And so like if I run this now, so even though the iPhone 6 Plus is taller, then this continues to say centered. And if I rotate the phone, it's still centered and on the bottom. So you can even kind of move this aside over here and say, well, I want this to be offset with respect to the center. Let me again update my constraints. So you can kind of see that it's a little bit off center here. So the tricky thing with auto layout is update constraints. The tricky thing with auto layout is, I mean, this makes sense, but let's say that I were to go back to this story and I'm kind of constraint happy, and I'm gonna say, oh, okay, well, let me kind of set a width right here. Cool, it's blue, it looks happy, right? And those of you are behind, watching this video are like kind of like maybe your spidey senses going off. You're like, hold on, something looks weird. But I'm like, well, there's no warning. What's weird about this? So for those of you who have kind of observed, I've specified a rule. Hey, be 8 from the left, be 8 from the right, and be this particular width. But that will only work for this particular phone. If this phone is any narrower or any wider, or if I rotate the phone, then it's not going to be able to satisfy all three rules simultaneously. So if I were to run this again, then it didn't crash. But if you think about it, it's clearly ignoring that width rule. And so I kind of scroll down here, and auto layouts punished me by kind of giving me this crazy error. So if we look carefully at this thing, it actually does slightly make sense. So you can say unable to simultaneously satisfy constraints. So in other words, there's too many rules to apply, and it dumps out all of these constraints. And so this crazy syntax is called the visual formatting language. And so if you're adding auto layout programmatically, then you're probably using this syntax to add your rules. So it looks pretty weird, but it's actually a pretty simple syntax. So I'll let you kind of look at it yourself in depth later, but just to help you parse this says this is a horizontal rule, right? And so this first horizontal rule is everything's in square brackets. So every view that we see here is in square brackets. And so for this particular view, make sure that it has a fixed size of 304. So because this is horizontal, this is your width. So I want to have a width of 304. So this rule means that for that same view, I want it to have a distance of 8 from the super view. So for my parent, that's what this vertical bar means. Or I have another rule where I want it to be on the right-hand side, 8 away from the parent. And so it is not happy with that. And so what it does when it can't satisfy this is it just randomly drops a single rule. So it's non-deterministic which one. Now the implementation will tend to pick the same one, but there's no guarantee, there's no rhyme or reason to which one it picks to drop. So in this case, it says, well, kind of makes sense. It chose the size constraint to break. And so when you're doing auto layout, if you see this come out, you need to. It's not an okay thing for this to have happened, even though it didn't crash the app. And so you have to go back and you have to make it so that these types of errors don't happen. And so in this case, I would come back and I would remove one of the constraints, which is the width constraint here. So we reviewed kind of adding margins and widths and heights, as well as kind of alignment over here, and then using this tool to update frames and constraints. This is really the basics of auto layout, and in general, at this tier, it's really straightforward. So people almost never run into issues on this. The challenge and the complexity of auto layout is when you're trying to deal with labels. So I'm going to address that in a different video, but this is just the basics of using the auto layout controls.